Greenland used to sit at the edge of most people's imagination. A white shape at the top of the map. A frozen mass between North America and Europe. A place invoked in weather reports, polar expeditions, school atlases, and climate documentaries, but rarely treated as one of the central pieces on the global chessboard. Then the world changed around it. The ice began to retreat faster than old assumptions could survive. The Arctic, once imagined as a barrier, started to look like a corridor. Rare minerals became the vocabulary of national security. Supply chains became weapons. Russia rebuilt northern military capacity. China watched the polar routes with patient ambition. NATO looked again at the North Atlantic. The United States remembered that Greenland sits closer to North America than most Americans realize. Denmark realized that the most strategically valuable part of its kingdom is also a place where most people do not think of themselves as Danish first. Suddenly, Greenland was everywhere. Not because it had moved, not because it had become new, but because the great powers finally noticed that the island they had treated as remote was actually positioned at the center of the century ahead. This is the story of Greenland, the island everyone suddenly wants. But it is not a story about empty land waiting to be used. It is a story about people, sovereignty, ice, memory, military ambition, mineral hunger, and the long shadow of colonial rule. It is about a small population on a vast island being forced to answer questions that much larger countries helped create. Who owns the Arctic future? Who controls the minerals beneath a warming world? Who decides what happens to land that others call strategic? And what happens when the world's most powerful countries look at a homeland and see a prize? Before Greenland became an American security concern, a Danish responsibility, a NATO asset, or a mineral frontier, it was a lived world. The first mistake outsiders often make is to imagine the island as empty because so much of it is ice. But emptiness is a colonial word. People who live in harsh landscapes do not see emptiness. They see routes, seasons, animals, weather, memory, and danger. For Inuit communities, Greenland was never a blank white space. It was coastline, sea ice, hunting grounds, family knowledge, settlement patterns, language, and survival skill. The island's inhabited life developed along its edges, where the sea provided food and movement, and where the difference between wisdom and carelessness could mean life or death. A fjord was not scenery. It was a place of decision. A current was not background. It was knowledge. A seal, a dog team, a kayak, a skin boat, a winter store of food, a story about weather. These were not picturesque details. They were infrastructure. Modern power often fails to recognize this because it prefers monuments, roads, armies, and written archives. But Greenlandic civilization was built through adaptation, not through stone empires. Its achievements were portable, seasonal, embodied, and oral. That does not make them lesser. It makes them suited to a world that punishes arrogance. This matters because every later outside power misunderstood Greenland in some version of the same way. Europeans looked for conversion, trade, and possession. Americans looked for bases, radar, and warning time. Investors looked for minerals. Scientists looked for ice cores. Strategists looked for routes and gaps. All of them saw something real. None of them saw the whole. The Greenlandic view begins elsewhere. This is not a platform. This is home. The Norse arrived in Greenland around the late 10th century, and their story is often told as an adventure of settlement at the edge of the known world. Eric the Red, exile, ocean crossing, farms in the southwest, churches, trade links, and the stubborn attempt to build a European life in an Arctic environment. For centuries, the Norse survived there. Then their settlements disappeared. The ruins they left behind became powerful symbols for later Europeans. They suggested a prior European connection to Greenland, a medieval claim layered onto the land. But the Norse story also contains a warning that modern outsiders still need to hear. Greenland does not reward systems that cannot adapt. The Norse brought animals, farming habits, social structures, and trade expectations from another world. For a time, they made them work. But climate shifts, economic isolation, changing trade routes, social pressures, and the difficulty of adapting to Arctic realities placed increasing strain on those settlements. The Inuit endured where the Norse vanished. That contrast is not just an archaeological detail. It is the first great lesson of Greenlandic history. Survival belongs to those who learn the island, not those who merely occupy it. European memory often turned the Norse remains into a story of lost settlers. But from Greenland's perspective, the deeper story is continuity. One way of living failed, another endured. The people who understood the Arctic as a living system remained. This matters today because modern states and companies still arrive with plans that look rational on paper. Bases, mines, airports, shipping corridors, development zones, energy projects. But Greenland is not paper. It is climate, distance, ice, sea, weather, community, and cost. The island has defeated imported certainty before. Denmark's modern relationship with Greenland grew slowly through mission, trade, administration, and colonial authority. The missionary Hans Egede arrived in the 18th century, searching in part for the descendants of the Norse, but instead encountered Inuit communities whose lives would be pulled into a new system of Christianity, commerce, regulation, and Danish control. Like many colonial systems, Danish rule often described itself in protective language. It presented itself as guidance, care, order, and civilization. But paternalism is still power. Greenlanders did not control the terms on which outside religion, trade, education, and administration entered their world. Danish authority shaped what could be bought, sold, taught, recorded, and governed. This colonial relationship did not look identical to the empires of plantation colonies or settler conquest farther south. Greenland's scale, climate, population, and administrative history made it different. But difference does not erase hierarchy. For generations, decisions were made in Copenhagen or through Danish-controlled institutions. Greenland was treated as a dependency to be managed, improved, and protected, not as a people whose future belonged fully to itself. The legacy of that arrangement is still alive. Modern Greenland is not simply angry at Denmark, and the relationship is not one-dimensional. There are family ties, administrative ties, economic support, education links, language complexities, and real affection in some places. But there is also memory. There is the memory of being spoken for, the memory of being studied, the memory of being helped in ways that also controlled, the memory of a system that often confused dependency with care. That is why the current debate about Greenland cannot be reduced to security or resources. It is also a post-colonial question. When Denmark speaks of responsibility, Greenland hears both support and history. When outsiders speak of Greenland's future, Greenland hears the echo of earlier voices deciding too much. For much of modern history, Greenland seemed distant to the main theaters of world power. The Second World War changed that. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark in 1940, Greenland's status could no longer be treated as a quiet colonial matter. The island suddenly sat in a strategic space between North America and Europe at a time when weather, air routes, shipping lanes, and North Atlantic defense mattered intensely. The United States stepped in. It treated Greenland as essential to hemispheric defense and to the wider war effort. Weather stations became valuable because North Atlantic weather shaped operations across Europe. Airfields mattered because aircraft needed routes. The island's location turned it into a military asset. This was a decisive transformation. Greenland did not become important because new mountains rose or new harbors appeared. It became important because technology changed the meaning of distance. Aviation made the Arctic less remote. Weather forecasting made northern observation valuable. Military planning made geography urgent. The American presence during the war created a pattern that would continue for decades. Washington saw Greenland through the logic of continental defense. Denmark, occupied and weakened, could not fully manage the island in the old way. Greenlanders themselves were pulled into a larger strategic order that they had not designed. The Second World War ended, but the American view of Greenland did not. The war had revealed the island as a northern platform. The Cold War would turn that platform into a permanent feature of nuclear-age strategy. The Cold War made Greenland one of the most important pieces of territory in the Western defense system. The Arctic was no longer a frozen emptiness. It was the shortest route between nuclear rivals. Soviet bombers and missiles made the northern sky a space of warning, fear, and calculation. The top of the world became a front line. Thule Air Base, now Patuxent Space Base, became the clearest symbol of this transformation. Built in northwest Greenland, it served American needs in radar, early warning, air operations, and later space surveillance. To Washington, it was essential. To NATO, it was part of the defense architecture of the North Atlantic. To Denmark, it was an alliance responsibility. To Greenlanders, it was also a reminder that their land could be reorganized for purposes decided elsewhere. The relocation of local Inuit communities connected to the Thule base remains one of the painful wounds in this history. Military necessity was treated as superior to local life. Families, hunting patterns, and ancestral ties were subordinated to strategic logic. This is why the base cannot be described only as a security asset. It is also a colonial memory in concrete and radar. The Cold War made Greenland visible to superpowers, but not fully powerful in its own right. The island mattered enormously, yet the people of the island had limited authority over why it mattered. That is the paradox that still shapes the present. Greenland is strategically central and politically small. Everyone says it matters. The question is whether it matters on its own terms. One of the strangest chapters in Greenland's Cold War history was Project Iceworm. The United States explored the idea of building a vast network beneath the ice sheet that could potentially house nuclear missiles. Camp Century, presented publicly as a research station, became linked to a hidden military imagination, a secret city under the ice, using Greenland's frozen interior as camouflage and strategic depth. The idea now sounds almost unreal, but it reveals how military planners saw Greenland at the height of the Cold War. The island was not only a place for radar or airfields. It was imagined as a possible underground weapons system, a landscape whose ice could be transformed into infrastructure for nuclear war. Then Greenland answered in its own language. The ice moved. It shifted. It was not the stable architecture planners needed. The project was abandoned, leaving behind physical and environmental legacies that would later raise concerns as climate change made old buried waste less safely buried. Project Iceworm is important because it shows the arrogance of treating ice as a passive material. The Greenland ice sheet is not a floor. It is a moving body, a planetary archive, a climate system. It can record human ambition, bury it, expose it, and mock it. The episode also carries a political lesson. The most extreme outside plans for Greenland were often made in secret or in technical language far from local democratic control. Greenland was not asked whether it wanted to become a hidden missile grid. The island was treated as strategic material. That habit did not disappear. It only changed form. In January 1968, a US B-52 carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Thule. The accident scattered radioactive contamination and turned the abstract danger of nuclear strategy into a physical emergency on Greenlandic land and ice. Cleanup followed, but the political and psychological residue remained. The crash mattered because it exposed what strategic planners often hide behind clean terminology. Deterrence sounds like doctrine. Early warning sounds like stability. Strategic patrol sounds like procedure. But all of these systems require real places to carry real risks. Greenland was one of those places. The people who lived there had not created the nuclear confrontation between Washington and Moscow, but their environment became part of its danger. For Denmark, the incident was politically sensitive because of questions about nuclear weapons and Danish policy. For Greenlanders, it became another example of decisions made far away producing consequences at home. The island was important enough to be used, but not powerful enough to fully control the risks placed upon it. The Thule crash belongs in the same moral archive as relocation, Project Iceworm, and base politics. It reminds us that being strategically valuable can be a burden. Great powers often describe their presence as protection, but protection can carry contamination, secrecy, and sacrifice. Greenland has lived with that contradiction for generations. Greenland's movement towards self-government developed through decades of political pressure, cultural assertion, and dissatisfaction with distant control. In 1979, Home Rule gave Greenland greater authority over domestic affairs. It did not create full sovereignty, but it marked a major break from older colonial administration. The meaning of Home Rule was not only legal, it was psychological. Greenlandic politics could now speak more directly in its own voice. Questions about language, education, fisheries, culture, social services, and development became matters of local democratic debate. Greenland was no longer merely an object inside Danish policy. It became a political actor inside the kingdom. This shift changed the way every outside power had to approach the island. The United States could not think only in terms of Danish approval. Denmark could not speak as if Greenland were simply an administrative region. Investors could not assume that Copenhagen alone defined the future. Greenlandic institutions now mattered. But home rule also revealed the limits of autonomy under dependency. Denmark still retained key authority in defense and foreign affairs. Economic support from Denmark remained central. Greenland had more power, but not complete control over the forces that made it strategically important. That tension would define the decades ahead. Growing self-government inside a structure still shaped by colonial history, alliance security, and economic reliance. The 2009 Self-Government Act deepened Greenland's autonomy and recognized Greenlanders as a people under international law, with a pathway toward independence if they choose it. This was a major constitutional and symbolic development. It said that Greenland's future status was not merely a Danish administrative question. It belonged to Greenlanders. But the act also made the hardest part of sovereignty clearer. Independence is not only a legal right. It is a practical challenge. A state must fund services, run institutions, negotiate with powerful neighbors, manage resources, defend interests, and sustain daily life. Greenland's economy remains heavily tied to fisheries and to the Danish block grant. That makes the path toward full independence possible, but complex. This is why Greenlandic independence politics cannot be understood as a simple yes or no question. Many Greenlanders want greater sovereignty. Many also understand that sovereignty without economic resilience can become vulnerable. If Denmark leaves, but another power dominates through money, mining, debt, or military dependency, the deeper purpose of self-determination would be weakened. The question is not only whether Greenland can become independent. The question is how it can become independent without becoming captured by a new patron. That is why the current global attention is so dangerous and so useful at the same time. Attention can become leverage. It can also become pressure. The world talks about Greenland's rare earths, air bases, and shipping routes, but Greenland's economy still rests heavily on the sea. Fisheries are the core of export income and employment. Shrimp, halibut, cod, and other marine resources connect Greenland to global markets and to local livelihoods. The future may be discussed in minerals, but the present is still built on fish. This matters because outside narratives often skip the economy Greenland actually has in favor of the economy outsiders want it to have. Mining companies imagine extraction. Strategists imagine bases. Tourists imagine wilderness. But fisheries provide the working foundation of the island's public finances and political stability. A serious discussion of independence must begin there. Climate change complicates this foundation. Warming waters can shift fish stocks, create new opportunities, and threaten existing patterns. The sea that sustains Greenland is changing. That means economic planning must be flexible, scientific, and careful. Greenland cannot simply replace dependency on Denmark with dependency on one volatile sector or one foreign-backed mine. Fisheries also connect sovereignty to environmental management. Control over marine resources is not only an economic issue. It is a national issue. If Greenland is to become more autonomous, the sea will remain one of the places where autonomy is exercised most directly. The Arctic future may be full of satellites and minerals, but Greenland still begins at the water's edge. Rare earth elements and critical minerals have made Greenland newly attractive to governments and companies. Modern technologies depend on them: electric vehicles, wind turbines, batteries, electronics, precision weapons, radar systems, satellites, and communications infrastructure. As the United States and Europe worry about China's dominance in parts of the supply chain, Greenland's geology looks more and more strategic. But a mineral deposit is not a mine. A mine is not an economy. And an economy built around extraction is not automatically sovereignty. Mining in Greenland faces huge practical challenges: distance, infrastructure, environmental risk, financing, labor, permitting, waste management, and local consent. Projects that look obvious on a strategic map may look far more complicated on the ground. The political question is who benefits. If rare earths are extracted mainly for foreign supply chains, with local communities carrying environmental risk and limited long-term gain, Greenland becomes another resource frontier. If projects are negotiated carefully, with strong regulation, transparency, local benefit, and environmental protection, minerals might help support greater autonomy. That is the tension. The world wants Greenland's minerals because it fears dependence. Greenland must make sure that helping others escape dependence does not create a new dependence for itself. The energy transition has a moral glow. Clean power, electric transport, batteries, wind turbines, and reduced fossil fuel dependence all promise a better future. But the technologies of that future require minerals. Those minerals come from places, often from remote places, often from places where indigenous communities, fragile ecosystems, and small populations are asked to carry the cost of global transformation. Greenland sits directly inside this contradiction. The world may ask Greenland to supply materials for a cleaner economy, but Greenlanders must live with the roads, pits, waste, ports, dust, labor camps, tailings, and political tensions that extraction can bring. A green transition for consumers can become an extractive burden for producers. This does not mean mining must never happen. It means mining cannot be treated as automatically virtuous because the final product is green. The ethics of a battery or turbine include the land where its minerals are extracted. Greenland's choices about mining should not be reduced to whether the world needs rare earths. The world does need them. The deeper question is whether it needs them badly enough to ignore Greenlandic consent, environmental caution, and long-term social consequences. A clean future built through old colonial habits would not be clean enough. Greenland's ice sheet is one of the great archives of the Earth. Deep inside the ice are layers of ancient snow compressed into climate memory. Ice cores contain trapped air, volcanic ash, dust, chemical signatures, and temperature clues stretching far back in time. Scientists read Greenland's ice the way historians read documents, except the archive is older than writing and far less forgiving. This gives Greenland a planetary role that no military or mining map can fully capture. The island is a witness to climate change. Its melting contributes to sea level rise that will affect coasts around the world. Its ice records abrupt shifts in the Earth system. Its surface reflects sunlight and interacts with global climate patterns. What happens in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. And yet the same melting that warns the world also attracts the world. Less ice can mean more access. More access can mean more shipping, exploration, tourism, mining, and military presence. This is the dark irony of the Arctic century. Climate danger creates economic and strategic opportunity. Greenland is therefore both alarm bell and prize. It tells the world something is wrong, while making powerful actors wonder what can be gained from the change. Few places reveal the moral confusion of climate politics more clearly. For NATO planners, Greenland's position near the Greenland-Iceland United Kingdom Gap is one of its most important features. The Geopolitics Gap is the maritime corridor through which Russian submarines and naval forces would move from the Arctic into the North Atlantic. During the Cold War, monitoring that gap was central to Western defense. After the Cold War, attention faded. Now it is returning. This geography matters because undersea warfare, missile submarines, surveillance, and North Atlantic reinforcement are all tied to the Northern Ocean. Greenland helps anchor awareness of that space. Radar, airfields, maritime patrols, satellite systems, and undersea monitoring all become more important when Russia rebuilds Arctic military capacity and NATO refocuses on high North defense. But the military vocabulary can erase the people on the map. To a planner, Greenland is a node in a surveillance network. To a Greenlander, it is a country in formation. The strategic value is real. So is the danger of allowing strategic value to dominate every other conversation. The question is not whether Greenland matters to NATO. It clearly does. The question is whether NATO can treat Greenland as more than terrain. A defense system that protects territory while ignoring the political dignity of the people who live there repeats the errors of older empires in modern alliance language. Russia has the world's largest Arctic coastline, and it has invested heavily in northern military infrastructure, bases, airfields, radar, missile systems, ports, icebreakers, and Arctic command structures. For Moscow, the Arctic is not a distant frontier. It is homeland, resource zone, military shield, and future route. That makes Greenland important to the West because it sits inside the system that watches and balances Russian movement. The Arctic is no longer a quiet post-Cold War space. It is becoming a theater of military planning again. Submarines, long-range missiles, undersea cables, satellite links, air patrols, and search and rescue capabilities all shape the region. Climate change makes access easier, but geopolitical tension makes access more dangerous. This does not mean war over Greenland is inevitable. It means the island's location gives it weight in the calculations of states preparing for crises they hope to avoid. Greenland is valuable because it gives warning, reach, and presence in a region where distance can quickly become vulnerability. For Greenlanders, this is both opportunity and burden. Strategic importance can bring investment and attention. It can also bring militarization and risk. A small society may find itself discussed in the language of deterrence by powers whose conflicts it did not create. China is not an Arctic state in the geographic sense, but it has worked to become an Arctic actor. It has invested in polar research, shipping concepts, resource interests, and diplomatic language that frames China as a near-Arctic state. Greenland matters in this context because it offers possible access to minerals, infrastructure, research, and position. Western concern about Chinese activity in Greenland often focuses on ports, airports, mining projects, and investment. A construction contract may appear commercial, but in a strategic environment, it can raise questions about long-term influence. A mine can become part of supply chain competition. A port can become dual-use anxiety. A research station can be read through intelligence concerns. In great power rivalry, almost nothing stays purely economic. But Greenland cannot simply reject every outside offer because a rival might benefit. It needs investment, infrastructure, and economic options. The challenge is to create rules strong enough to welcome useful partnerships without surrendering strategic control. That requires expertise, transparency, and political unity. China's approach is often patient. Influence can grow through financing, relationships, and commercial footholds long before it looks like power. Greenland's task is to understand that patience and negotiate from its own interests, not from the panic of others. American interest in Greenland is older than the latest headlines. The United States has considered the island strategically valuable for more than a century, and after the Second World War it even explored buying it from Denmark. That history matters because modern talk of acquisition did not come from nowhere. It revived an old idea, that Greenland is too important to American security to remain outside American control. From a U.S. strategic perspective, the attraction is obvious. Greenland sits near North America, the Arctic, the North Atlantic, and Europe. It hosts important defense infrastructure. It may contain critical minerals. It could shape future shipping, surveillance, and missile warning systems. In a world of rivalry with Russia and China, Greenland looks like a prize. But the language of purchase is politically explosive because it treats a homeland like property. Greenland is not a warehouse, not a military platform, and not a real estate listing. It is a society with a right to decide its own future. Denmark cannot simply sell it. The United States cannot simply demand it. Greenlanders cannot be bypassed because a larger power sees advantage. The old acquisition dream reveals the persistence of imperial thinking inside modern strategy. A great power looks at a place and sees need. But need is not ownership. Renewed American pressure around Greenland created a diplomatic crisis because it challenged assumptions inside the Western alliance. The United States and Denmark are NATO allies. NATO is built on defense, sovereignty, and trust. When the strongest ally pressures another ally over an autonomous territory, the issue becomes larger than one island. It becomes a test of alliance norms. Greenlandic and Danish leaders rejected the idea that the island could be bought or controlled. The reaction was not only legal, it was emotional and historical. For Greenlanders, the idea of purchase revived the old experience of being treated as an object. For Denmark, it challenged sovereignty. For Europe, it raised the question of whether American power could become coercive even inside its own alliance system. This is why Greenland matters beyond the Arctic. If Western countries speak of sovereignty when confronting Russia or China, they must also respect sovereignty when dealing with their own partners. Otherwise, the language becomes conditional. Rivals notice that. Allies notice it too. The United States can be an important partner for Greenland. But partnership cannot begin with possession fantasies. It begins with respect, patience, and direct engagement with Greenlandic authority. Denmark faces a difficult and delicate role. It must support Greenland, respect Greenland's autonomy, manage the kingdom's constitutional structure, defend Arctic interests, coordinate with NATO, and respond to American pressure. Too much Danish control risks confirming colonial patterns. Too little Danish engagement risks leaving Greenland vulnerable to stronger powers. The Danish block grant helps sustain Greenland's public services, but it also symbolizes dependency. Danish authority in defense and foreign policy remains important, but Greenlandic self-government makes unilateral decision-making increasingly politically unacceptable. Copenhagen must therefore behave less like an owner and more like a partner, even while the legal structure has not fully caught up with the political reality. This is hard because partnership after colonial rule requires more than good intentions. It requires listening differently. It requires accepting that Greenland's eventual independence is not a betrayal, but a legitimate possibility. It requires supporting capacity building even if that capacity eventually reduces Denmark's role. Denmark's challenge is to help Greenland become strong enough to choose freely, including the freedom to choose a future beyond Denmark. That is a painful kind of responsibility for a former colonial power, but it may be the only ethical one. Foreigners often imagine Greenland through icebergs, sled dogs, polar bears, and remote settlements. But the future of Greenland is also being shaped in Nuuk, the capital. Nuuk is not a frozen postcard. It is a modern political center with government offices, housing pressures, cultural institutions, construction, schools, young professionals, parliamentary debates, and international visitors. Nuuk matters because it turns the grand questions into practical ones. Independence becomes public administration. Mining becomes licensing and environmental review. Military strategy becomes consultation and legal language. Tourism becomes airport capacity and housing supply. Climate adaptation becomes infrastructure. Identity becomes education and language policy. The capital is where symbolism becomes governance. This is important because sovereignty is not only declared at ceremonies. It is built in offices, budgets, classrooms, training programs, and negotiations. Greenland's ability to manage outside attention will depend on whether its institutions can grow fast enough to meet the complexity arriving at its door. The world may discuss Greenland from Washington, Copenhagen, Brussels, Moscow, and Beijing. But the decisions that matter most must increasingly pass through Nuuk. That shift is one of the quiet revolutions of the Arctic. Infrastructure may decide Greenland's future more than speeches. Airports, ports, energy systems, telecommunications, housing, undersea cables, roads, and logistics determine who can operate on the island and under what conditions. Infrastructure is not neutral. It is power made physical. If Greenland builds new airports, tourism changes. If it builds ports, mining and military access change. If foreign companies finance telecommunications, security concerns arise. If energy systems remain limited, industrial development remains constrained. Every project creates future possibilities and future dependencies. This is why outside financing must be treated carefully. A loan, contract, or construction bid can shape sovereignty for decades. Who builds? Who owns? Who maintains? Who controls access? What happens if debts cannot be paid? What data flows through the system? What military use might follow civilian infrastructure? The Arctic competition may be decided quietly through infrastructure before it is ever decided through dramatic confrontation. Greenland's independence will be measured not only by political status, but by who controls the systems that make modern life possible. Greenland's beauty is undeniable. Icebergs, fjords, northern lights, mountains, whales, silence, and scale give the island an almost mythic appeal. Tourism can bring jobs, income, and international connection. It can also create distortion. Outsiders may arrive seeking wilderness while ignoring the society that lives there. This is a common problem in remote places. Visitors want authenticity, but they often define authenticity from outside. They want untouched landscapes, traditional images, and dramatic nature. They may be less interested in housing shortages, language politics, supermarket prices, colonial history, or the daily life of modern Greenlanders. Tourism can also strain small communities. More flights, cruise ships, waste, search and rescue needs, and seasonal labor can change local economies quickly. The question is not whether tourism is good or bad. The question is whether Greenland controls it, benefits from it, and limits it where necessary. The world wants to see Greenland before it changes. Greenland must make sure that being seen does not become another form of being consumed. The dream of independence carries both dignity and danger. For many Greenlanders, independence means finally completing the journey from colonial rule to self-determination. It means speaking as a country in its own name. It means controlling resources, foreign policy, identity, and national direction. But independence without resilience can become fragile. The danger is replacement dependency. If Greenland leaves Denmark but becomes overly dependent on American defense money, Chinese investment, mining corporations, or a narrow export sector, formal sovereignty may not produce real freedom. A flag can fly over a country whose choices are still constrained by outside power. That is why Greenland's path must be careful. It needs economic diversification, institutional capacity, education, infrastructure, and bargaining skill. It needs partners, but not masters. It needs investment, but not capture. It needs security, but not militarized subordination. The question is not whether Greenland deserves independence. Self-determination answers that. The question is how to make independence durable enough that it means more than a new dependency with a new name. Great power maps rarely show ordinary lives. They show bases, routes, deposits, corridors, and zones. But Greenland's future belongs to people raising children, paying rent, studying, fishing, hunting, working in shops, serving in government, caring for elders, debating politics, and trying to imagine a future that is both modern and Greenlandic. This human scale matters. A mining project may look small on a national map, but huge to a nearby community. A military agreement may look technical in Washington, but symbolic in Greenland. A new airport may sound like development, but bring housing pressure, cultural change, and outside influence. A tourism boom may create jobs and also make residents feel like scenery in their own home. If Greenland is valued only for what it offers others, then Greenlanders become secondary in the story. That is the old pattern. The new pattern must be different. The island's strategic importance should strengthen local life, not sacrifice it. The real test of Greenland's future is not whether powerful countries mention it more often. It is whether Greenlanders gain more dignity, security, authority, and choice because of that attention. Greenland is wanted because the world is afraid of the future. Afraid of China's mineral dominance. Afraid of Russian Arctic power. Afraid of losing control over sea routes. Afraid of climate change. Afraid of energy transition without supply chains. Afraid of alliance weakness. Afraid of being late to the next great strategic map. But Greenland is not only a solution to other people's fears. It is a homeland with its own future. That is the fact every empire, investor, strategist, president, and diplomat must confront. The island may be rich in minerals, vital for defense, central to climate science, and positioned at the hinge of the Arctic century. But none of that makes it empty. None of that makes it available. None of that cancels the right of Greenlanders to decide what happens next. The ice is melting. The routes are opening. The minerals are being counted. The bases are being upgraded. The diplomats are arriving. The world has looked north and seen opportunity. Greenland has looked back and asked to be seen as more than that. The island everyone suddenly wants is not a prize. It is a people. And the next chapter of Arctic history will depend on whether the world can finally understand the difference. One of the clearest signs that Greenland has entered a new era is the arrival of diplomatic attention in Nuuk. Consulates are not dramatic like warships. They do not look like mines, bases, or flags planted in ice. But they matter because they show where governments expect future conversations to happen. When countries increase their diplomatic presence, they are saying that the place is no longer peripheral. It is a center of contact. For Greenland, this matters deeply. A consulate is a doorway. It means more direct conversation, more visits, more cooperation, more informal influence, and more visibility. It can support trade, research, culture, education, security dialogue, and investment. It can also signal competition. When several outside powers begin showing up more seriously, the capital becomes a diplomatic arena. Nuuk's growing diplomatic weight reflects a larger transformation. Greenland used to be discussed mainly through Copenhagen. Now foreign governments increasingly understand that speaking about Greenland without speaking to Greenland is politically outdated. This does not mean Denmark is irrelevant. It remains central to the kingdom and to defense and foreign policy structures. But the practical reality is changing. Greenlandic institutions are becoming harder to bypass. This is a quiet but important form of sovereignty, not a declaration of independence, but the gradual accumulation of direct recognition. The more the world comes to Nuuk, the more Nuuk becomes a capital in fact, not only in local law. That changes the psychology of the island. It tells Greenlanders that their future is not merely an internal Danish matter. It is international. And once a place becomes international, it becomes harder to make decisions about it in private. The Arctic Council has long been one of the main forums for circumpolar cooperation. It deals with environmental issues, scientific work, indigenous participation, sustainable development, and Arctic governance. It is not a military alliance. That is part of its importance. In a region increasingly discussed through security and rivalry, the Arctic Council represents another vision, that the Arctic is not only a battlefield of future competition, but also a shared environment requiring cooperation. Greenland sits inside that world in a complicated way. It is not a fully independent state, yet it is central to Arctic life. Its people are indigenous Arctic people. Its land and ice are central to climate science. Its political future affects the balance between Denmark, North America, and the wider Arctic community. Any serious Arctic system that treats Greenland as secondary misses one of the essential realities of the region. The Council also reveals the limits of formal categories. Sovereignty, self-government, indigenous rights, state diplomacy, and environmental governance all overlap in the Arctic. Greenland is not simply a subnational territory. It is not fully sovereign either. Its position forces institutions to deal with complexity. That complexity may become more important in the years ahead. As military competition rises, cooperative institutions become more fragile but also more necessary. Greenland's future will depend partly on whether the Arctic can preserve spaces for science, environment, and indigenous voice, even as the strategic temperature rises. If every Arctic conversation becomes a security conversation, Greenland risks being reduced once again to location. If cooperative politics survives, Greenland has more room to speak as a society. For years, Hans Island was treated almost humorously in international media. A tiny island between Greenland and Canada, claimed by both Denmark and Canada, with soldiers leaving flags and bottles in a strange Arctic ritual of polite dispute. The eventual resolution of the dispute, which created a land border between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark, was small in territorial scale, but large in symbolic meaning. Hans Island showed that Arctic sovereignty can be negotiated peacefully. It showed that northern borders do not have to become crises. It also showed that even tiny pieces of rock matter when the Arctic becomes more strategically visible. In a region of ice, routes, sea claims, and continental shelves, every border carries meaning. For Greenland, the episode also demonstrated how easily Greenlandic territory can become part of diplomatic stories told by larger states. Denmark and Canada negotiated, but the land is connected to Greenland's geography and future. The question of how much Greenland participates in such matters is part of the larger story of self-government and foreign policy authority. Small borders often reveal big principles. Hans Island was not a war. It was not a major resource prize, but it forced states to answer a basic Arctic question. Can disputes be resolved through law, negotiation, and recognition rather than pressure? Greenland's larger future depends on that same question being answered on a much bigger scale. Arctic competition is not only about land. It is also about the seabed. Under international law, coastal states can make claims related to continental shelves, potentially extending rights over seabed resources beyond their exclusive economic zones if geological conditions support those claims. In the Arctic, this has turned underwater geology into diplomacy. Ridges, basins, and mapped formations become evidence. Science becomes sovereignty work. Greenland's position matters in these claims because the island is tied to the Kingdom of Denmark's Arctic geography. Denmark has used Greenland's location in its own Arctic claims, including claims connected to the seabed near the North Pole. This reveals another layer of Greenland's importance. Even the underwater terrain around it can become part of national ambition. For Greenlanders, this creates both opportunity and tension. On one hand, Arctic claims can increase the strategic importance of the kingdom and, indirectly, Greenland's leverage. On the other hand, they raise familiar questions. Who speaks for the territory? Who benefits from future rights? Who decides whether seabed resources should be explored? How do Greenlandic interests fit inside claims made by Denmark? The Arctic seabed reminds us that sovereignty is three-dimensional. It is not only land and airspace. It is water, ice, seabed, data, routes, and geological arguments made in international institutions. Greenland's future will be shaped not only by what sits visibly on the island, but also by what lies beneath and around it. Language is one of the deepest forms of sovereignty. Greenlandic is not only a means of communication. It is a way of holding memory, place, humor, family, weather, and political dignity. Under colonial rule, language often becomes one of the first battlefields because controlling education and administration shapes how people imagine authority. In Greenland, the struggle to strengthen Greenlandic while also navigating Danish and English is central to the future. A fully self-governing or independent Greenland needs multilingual capacity. Danish remains important because of legal, administrative, educational, and historical ties. English is increasingly necessary for diplomacy, business, science, tourism, and engagement with the United States and other partners. But if outside languages dominate too strongly, the political project can become hollow. A country cannot fully govern itself if its deepest public life is constantly forced through someone else's vocabulary. This is not only cultural, it is practical. Environmental law, mining contracts, defense agreements, education systems, public health, and diplomacy all require technical language. Greenland must build expertise in the languages of global power while preserving the language that makes the society itself. That balance is difficult, but it is also essential. The future of Greenland will not be decided only in bases and mines. It will be decided in classrooms, translation offices, parliamentary debate, radio, literature, and the everyday choice of which language carries authority. Sovereignty requires people, not in the abstract, but in the form of trained administrators, lawyers, engineers, teachers, doctors, pilots, environmental regulators, diplomats, economists, geologists, port managers, fisheries experts, and negotiators. For a small population, building this capacity is one of the hardest tasks of self-determination. Education is therefore not a side issue in Greenland. It is state building. If Greenland wants to negotiate with mining companies, regulate foreign investment, manage airports, oversee environmental standards, shape tourism, and participate in international diplomacy, it needs its own expert base. Otherwise, it must rely too heavily on outside consultants whose technical skill may not always align with Greenlandic priorities. This is especially important because outside pressure is accelerating. The world is not politely waiting for Greenland to build capacity at its own pace. Companies arrive with lawyers. States arrive with strategic papers. Military planners arrive with technical language. Climate scientists arrive with models. If Greenlandic institutions are under-resourced, the island may find itself responding rather than directing. Education is the slow answer to fast pressure. It does not create headlines like a new base or a rare earth discovery. But over decades, it may matter more than either. A society that can produce its own experts can bargain differently. It can say yes more carefully, no more confidently, and maybe later, independence more securely. The outside world often speaks of Greenland's future as if development is automatically good. More investment, more flights, more mines, more bases, more tourism, more attention. But rapid change carries social costs, especially in small societies. A single large project can affect housing, prices, labor markets, migration, local politics, and cultural life. What looks like growth from outside can feel like pressure from within. Greenland already faces serious social challenges. Housing shortages, service delivery across vast distances, health pressures, education gaps, and the long psychological shadow of colonial disruption and rapid modernization. These issues do not disappear because the island becomes strategically fashionable. In fact, Outside attention can make them worse if it drives prices, concentrates money in a few places, or encourages decisions made for geopolitical benefit rather than local well-being. A mine can create jobs, but also dependency. Tourism can create income, but also seasonal inequality. A base can bring contracts, but also political tension. Infrastructure can connect communities, but also transform them. There is no simple formula. This is why the human scale must remain central. The success of Greenland's future should not be measured only by GDP, investment totals, or diplomatic visits. It should be measured by whether ordinary Greenlanders have better lives, stronger communities, more choice, and more control. Without that, development is just another word outsiders use while taking what they came for. The future of Greenland will be decided in large part by young Greenlanders. They inherit a world their grandparents could hardly have imagined. Social media, global travel, climate anxiety, strategic attention, new education pathways, old colonial memories, language debates, and the possibility of independence. They are asked to be both modern and rooted, global and Greenlandic, practical and visionary. Many young people face a difficult choice: leave for education and opportunity, or remain and build a future at home. Some move between Greenland and Denmark. Some return. Some do not. This movement matters because small societies cannot afford to lose too much of their skilled youth. Brain drain is not only an economic problem, it is a sovereignty problem. At the same time, young Greenlanders may be the best equipped to navigate the island's new position. They can speak across languages, platforms, and cultures. They can challenge old paternal relationships while also questioning simplistic nationalism. They can demand climate action, economic opportunity, and cultural respect at the same time. A future Greenland that is confident enough to deal with the United States, Denmark, China, NATO, and global markets will need a generation that knows the outside world without being swallowed by it. That is a difficult identity to build, but it may be the most important resource Greenland has. The phrase, "empty north," has done enormous damage. It turns inhabited places into strategic space. It makes military expansion sound harmless, mining sound inevitable, and outside control sound efficient. But the Arctic is not empty. It is simply populated differently from the temperate cities where most political power sits. Low population density does not mean low political value. A small community may hold generations of knowledge about weather, wildlife, sea ice, and local change. A hunting area may not look economically productive on a spreadsheet, but it may be central to identity and food culture. A landscape without highways may still be full of routes. A quiet place may be politically alive. This matters because outsiders often treat Greenland's small population as a reason to discount its authority. How can so few people control so much land? But that question reveals an imperial instinct. Rights are not proportional to population density. A homeland does not become available because it is sparsely populated. The Arctic future will be morally shaped by whether the world abandons the myth of emptiness. If it does not, the new scramble will repeat the old one. If it does, Greenland may become a model for a different kind of geopolitics, one where small populations in strategic places are not erased by the scale of outside desire. Scientists have come to Greenland for generations to study ice, climate, geology, wildlife, and the Arctic environment. Much of this work is valuable not only to Greenland, but to the world. Ice core research has transformed understanding of abrupt climate change. Glaciology helps predict sea level rise. Arctic ecology reveals changes that may later affect the planet far beyond the island. But scientific importance does not remove the need for local respect. Research is not neutral simply because it is not commercial. Scientists use land, infrastructure, funding, data, and local access. They shape global narratives about Greenland. They may influence policy. If Greenland is treated only as a laboratory, another form of extraction appears: knowledge extraction. Responsible research must include local institutions, Greenlandic priorities, data sharing, education, and respect for communities. It should strengthen Greenland's own scientific capacity rather than turning the island into a place where outsiders collect information and leave. This is especially important as climate change accelerates. Greenland's ice has become a planetary warning system, but Greenlanders should not be reduced to witnesses beside the instruments. They should be partners in defining what research is done, how it is interpreted, and how its benefits return to the society that hosts it. Camp Century, associated with Cold War research and the hidden ambitions of Project Iceworm, left behind waste beneath the ice. For decades, burial under snow and ice seemed like a kind of disappearance. But climate change has a way of returning the past. As ice conditions change, old waste can become a future environmental problem. This is one of the most powerful metaphors in Greenland's story. Decisions made by outside powers do not vanish because documents are archived and bases are abandoned. They remain in ice, soil, water, memory, and politics. The Arctic preserves. Then, under warming conditions, it reveals. Camp Century's legacy raises hard questions. Who is responsible for waste left behind by military projects? Who pays for monitoring and cleanup? How should Greenland be compensated for risks created by others? What happens when climate change exposes infrastructure designed under assumptions that no longer hold? The story is not only about one site. It is about a wider pattern of strategic use without long-term accountability. Greenland has hosted the ambitions of larger powers. Now some of those ambitions are thawing back into view. The future of Arctic security must include the cleanup of its past. Patuxent Space Base is not only a Cold War relic. It remains relevant in the age of satellites, missile warning, missile defense, and space surveillance. Modern military power depends on space systems, communication, navigation, missile detection, targeting, intelligence, weather, and timing. Greenland's northern position makes it valuable in that architecture. This gives the island a role in conflicts that may never visibly arrive on its shores. A radar in Greenland can matter to missile warning. A tracking station can matter to satellites. A base in the Arctic can matter to North American defense and NATO planning. The island is physically remote but digitally and strategically connected to global systems of war and deterrence. That makes local consent even more important, not less. As technology becomes more abstract, the temptation is to describe the base in technical language that hides its political meaning. Space surveillance sounds clean. Missile warning sounds defensive. But these missions still embed Greenland in the security calculations of powerful states. Greenland must therefore ask not only what happens on its land, but what global systems its land supports. In the space age, sovereignty reaches upward. Western governments often speak of the rules-based order. The phrase appears in speeches about borders, sovereignty, aggression, and international law. Greenland tests whether those principles apply when the pressure comes from inside the Western alliance rather than from outside it. If Russia pressures neighbors, the West condemns it. If China uses economic leverage, the West warns about coercion. But if the United States pressures Denmark or Greenland because it wants strategic control, the moral language becomes uncomfortable. The issue is not whether American security concerns are real. They are. The issue is whether real concerns justify treating another people's homeland as negotiable. This is why Greenland has become a symbolic test. It shows whether small territories connected to allies are protected by the same principles invoked elsewhere. It asks whether indigenous self-determination matters when the land is strategically useful. It asks whether alliance means partnership or hierarchy. The rules-based order will not be judged only by how it confronts enemies. It will be judged by how it behaves when its own strongest members are tempted. Greenland is one of those temptations. Greenland is not alone in facing the challenge of small population, strategic location, and great power interest. Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Pacific Island states, Caribbean states, and many small Arctic and maritime societies have all had to bargain with larger powers. Their experiences offer lessons. Small states can gain leverage by diversifying partners, building expertise, strengthening law, using international institutions, controlling infrastructure, protecting transparency, and refusing secrecy where secrecy would create dependency. They can also be vulnerable to debt, elite capture, over-reliance on one sector, and the promise of quick money from powerful outsiders. For Greenland, comparison is useful but not simple. Its geography, colonial history, mineral potential, and defense role are unique. Still, the broader lesson holds. Smallness does not eliminate agency, but agency must be built deliberately. It requires institutions strong enough to withstand pressure and political cultures strong enough to debate hard choices without being divided by outside money. The best future for Greenland may not come from choosing one protector. It may come from becoming skilled enough to keep several partners in balance, while making clear that the final direction belongs to Greenlanders. At some point, Greenland's path may lead to a formal independence referendum. That possibility is built into the political imagination of the island. But a referendum is not only a date on a calendar, it is the end point of a long preparation, or it risks becoming a leap into uncertainty. The questions before such a vote would be immense. What currency would Greenland use? How would the Danish bloc grant be replaced? What defense agreements would remain? How would citizenship work? What would happen to education ties with Denmark? How would healthcare be funded? What foreign partners would be prioritized? How would mining revenue be regulated? How would the Constitution protect language, land, and democratic accountability? These are not arguments against independence. They are the practical architecture of independence. A serious independence movement must answer them because sovereignty deserves more than emotion. It deserves durability. When outsiders discuss Greenland, they often jump to the drama of independence. Greenland's own debate is often more mature than that. It understands that the question is not only whether to become independent, but how to become independent in a way that improves life rather than simply changes legal status. Greenland has been studied intensely by outsiders: anthropologists, missionaries, administrators, explorers, military planners, climate scientists, geologists, journalists, and strategists. Some of that work has been respectful. Some has been extractive. The experience of being constantly interpreted by others can produce fatigue. A society becomes tired of being an object of fascination. This matters because the current wave of attention can feel familiar in an uncomfortable way. Again, outsiders arrive with questions. What minerals are there? What does the ice show? What does America need? What does NATO need? What does Denmark fear? What does China want? What route will open? What base must be expanded? The questions may be new, but the pattern is old. A more respectful approach would begin with Greenland's own questions. What kind of economy does Greenland want? What level of military presence is acceptable? What does cultural survival require? How should climate adaptation be funded? What partnerships strengthen sovereignty rather than weaken it? What must be protected from development? The difference between being studied and being heard is power. Greenland has been studied for a long time. The future depends on whether it is heard. Outsiders often speak of the Arctic as if it were a single region with one future. But the Arctic is many places: Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Svalbard, northern Scandinavia, the Russian Arctic, indigenous homelands, shipping routes, energy fields, military zones, and scientific landscapes. Each has its own politics, history, ecology, and legal structure. Greenland's Arctic is not Russia's Arctic. It is not Alaska. It is not Norway. It is not the Canadian North. Its relationship to Denmark, its indigenous majority, its island geography, its ice sheet, and its path toward independence make it distinct. Treating all Arctic issues as one strategic game can obscure the local differences that matter most. This matters because policy designed for the Arctic in general may fail in Greenland specifically. A security solution may ignore self-government. A mining strategy may ignore local politics. A climate plan may ignore economic dependency. A shipping forecast may ignore infrastructure limits. The Arctic future will not be decided by one master plan. It will be negotiated place by place. Greenland's voice matters because it knows which Arctic it is. Powerful states often justify their presence in smaller places through protection. The United States protects Greenland and North America. Denmark supports Greenland through the kingdom. NATO protects the North Atlantic. Scientists help protect the planet by studying ice. Environmental groups protect fragile ecosystems. Each claim may contain truth, but protection becomes dangerous when it reduces the protected people's agency. The history of empire is full of protection language. Colonies were protected. Indigenous people were protected. Trade routes were protected. Strategic assets were protected. Often the protection protected the interests of the protector first. Greenland's history makes this language sensitive. Real protection must be accountable to the people it claims to protect. It must include consent, transparency, benefit, and the right to refuse. If a base protects the West but harms local authority, the protection is incomplete. If an environmental policy protects wilderness but traps Greenland in dependency, it is not justice. If Danish support protects welfare but limits self-determination, it must evolve. The moral question is not whether Greenland needs partners. It does. The question is whether those partners can protect without possessing. There is a possible future in which Greenland becomes a model rather than a battleground. In that future, the island uses outside attention to strengthen education, infrastructure, healthcare, environmental regulation, and democratic capacity. It negotiates defense agreements with transparency. It accepts investment selectively. It develops tourism carefully. It mines only where local consent and environmental standards are strong. It builds partnerships with Denmark, the United States, the Nordics, the European Union, indigenous networks, and others without surrendering control to any one power. This future is difficult, but not impossible. It requires patience from outsiders and discipline from Greenlandic politics. It requires rejecting both isolation and capture. It requires admitting that sovereignty is built through capacity before it is completed through status. The alternative is a Greenland pulled apart by outside urgency. One power wants bases, another wants minerals, another wants contracts, another wants influence. The island becomes crowded with promises, and decisions are made too quickly because everyone says the moment is historic. Greenland's advantage is that it has survived long histories of outside desire. It knows that urgency is often the language of others. Its own future may require a slower wisdom. The United States cannot ignore Greenland because geography will not let it. From the perspective of North American defense, Greenland sits in the upper approaches to the continent, between the Arctic Ocean, the North Atlantic, and the air and missile routes that military planners have studied for generations. In the Cold War, that meant Soviet bombers and missiles. Today it means missile warning, space surveillance, Arctic access, Russian military renewal, Chinese polar ambition, and the vulnerability of northern infrastructure. This does not make American pressure legitimate when it becomes coercive, but it does explain why the American security establishment keeps returning to the island. Great powers are often pulled back to places that solve basic geographic problems. Greenland gives warning time. It gives position. It gives reach. It gives the United States a northern anchor that cannot be replicated somewhere else with the same effect. The problem is that security planners often think in necessities, while societies think in rights. A planner says the base is essential. A Greenlander asks who decided. A strategist says the Arctic is heating up. A local community asks whether that means more aircraft, more restrictions, more foreign workers, more environmental risk. A president says the island is vital. Greenlanders hear an old grammar of possession. The United States has a real interest in Greenland. But if it wants a durable relationship, it must understand the difference between interest and entitlement. The first can be negotiated. The second will be resisted. Greenland's relationship with Europe is unusual. It is connected to Denmark, and Denmark is a member of the European Union. But Greenland itself left the European Economic Community in the 1980s after gaining home rule. Fisheries were central to that decision. Greenland wanted greater control over its waters and resources, and the European framework did not fit Greenlandic priorities. This history matters because it shows that Greenland has already made one major choice to step back from a larger political economic system when that system seemed to limit local control. It also means Greenland's relationship with Europe is layered, outside the EU in formal terms, connected through Denmark, linked through trade and cooperation, and increasingly important to European strategic thinking. Europe now wants critical minerals, Arctic stability, climate data, and security coordination. Greenland may want investment, markets, education links, and diplomatic support. But the old fisheries dispute reminds us that Greenland does not automatically accept outside frameworks, just because they are presented as modern or cooperative. The island has a history of saying no when sovereignty over resources is at stake. This creates an opportunity. Europe can approach Greenland differently than older empires did, not as a possession, not as a passive supplier, but as a partner with its own political priorities. Whether Europe can actually do that remains an open question. Mineral wealth often arrives first as a promise. jobs, revenue, independence, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, new roads, and a stronger future. In a place like Greenland, where the dream of economic self-sufficiency is tied to sovereignty, the promise can be powerful. A mine is not only a mine, it can be presented as the bridge to independence. But mineral politics can divide small societies. Some communities may support projects because they need jobs. Others may oppose them because they fear environmental damage. National politicians may see revenue. Local residents may see risk. Foreign investors may promise transformation while seeking favorable terms. Outside governments may support projects because they want supply chains, not because they care about Greenlandic welfare. This creates a dangerous emotional field. To oppose a mine may be framed as opposing independence. To support a mine may be framed as selling the land. Both accusations can become too simple. A serious society needs room to ask harder questions. What kind of mining? Under whose ownership? With what environmental protections? For how long? With what local benefit? What happens after closure? Who cleans the waste? What if prices collapse? Greenland's mineral future should not be decided by desperation or romance. It should be decided through institutions strong enough to slow down the promise and examine the contract. The Kvanefjeld rare earth and uranium controversy became one of the clearest examples of Greenland asserting that not every strategic resource must be developed on outside terms. The project attracted global attention because it involved rare earth elements that could matter to Western supply chains. But it also raised deep environmental and political concerns, especially because of uranium. The debate showed that Greenland is not simply waiting for mining companies to arrive. Greenlandic politics can block, delay, restrict, and contest projects that do not fit the society's understanding of acceptable risk. This is a crucial point. Sovereignty is not measured only by the ability to approve development. It is also measured by the ability to refuse it. The outside world may see Kvanefjeld as a missed opportunity or a supply chain frustration. Many Greenlanders saw a different question. Should the pursuit of economic independence require accepting a project that could reshape land, water, and public trust for generations? The answer was not merely technical. It was democratic. In the Arctic century, Greenland's most powerful word may sometimes be no. Not no to the world, not no to development, but no to the assumption that global demand automatically overrides local judgment. Greenland's ice sheet is often discussed through sea level rise. But sea level rise is not an abstract number. It is the future of coastal cities, river deltas, island states, ports, military bases, insurance markets, and migration. When Greenland melts, the consequences travel far beyond the Arctic. The island's ice is connected to homes thousands of miles away. This gives Greenland an eerie role in global politics. It is both victim and source of consequence. Warming is not caused mainly by Greenlanders. Yet Greenland's melting ice helps reshape the world. The injustice is obvious. A small Arctic population living with rapid environmental change becomes part of a planetary crisis created largely by industrial systems elsewhere. Future climate migration may make Greenland's ice even more politically charged. People displaced by rising seas may never see Greenland, but part of their story may be connected to its melting. Governments may talk about adaptation, seawalls, relocation, and disaster finance. The ice sheet becomes not only a scientific concern, but a moral one. This is another reason the world should approach Greenland with humility. The island is giving the planet a warning at enormous cost to itself. To respond by seeing only mining opportunities and shipping routes would be a failure of imagination. If the Arctic becomes busier, search and rescue becomes more important. More ships, cruise vessels, aircraft, mining projects, research expeditions, and military patrols mean more chances for accidents in a region where distance and weather can turn small emergencies into major disasters. Greenland's coastline is vast. Its infrastructure is limited. Arctic rescue is difficult, expensive, and time-sensitive. This matters because outside excitement about new routes often ignores the systems needed to make those routes safe. A cruise ship in trouble, an oil spill, a mining accident, a downed aircraft, or a vessel trapped by ice can demand resources far beyond what local communities can easily provide. If the world wants more access to Greenlandic waters, who pays for the safety net? Search and rescue is sovereignty in practical form. The state or authority responsible for saving lives must have capacity. If Greenland is expected to host more activity, it needs investment not only in tourist facilities or mines, but in emergency systems, ports, helicopters, medical evacuation, communication, and trained personnel. The Arctic does not forgive shallow planning. Every new activity requires a response plan. Greenland's future development must include the boring but vital question. If something goes wrong, who comes, how fast, and under whose command? For years, Greenland's offshore oil and gas potential attracted interest. A warmer Arctic and high energy prices made some outsiders imagine another northern petroleum frontier. But Greenland has also taken steps to move away from oil exploration, reflecting environmental, economic, and political concerns. This choice matters because it shows that Greenland's future is not only about saying yes to every possible resource. The decision not to pursue certain fossil fuel paths can be read in several ways. It may reflect climate responsibility. It may reflect economic realism, given the high cost and risk of Arctic drilling. It may reflect a desire to protect fisheries and environment. It may also reflect political identity. Greenland does not want its future defined entirely by extractive cycles. This creates a contrast. The world that warmed the Arctic through fossil fuels now looks north for new opportunities created by that warming. Greenland has reason to be cautious. Oil development could bring revenue, but also spills, dependency, volatility, and reputational cost. The deeper lesson is that resource sovereignty includes the right to leave resources undeveloped. A country does not prove its maturity by extracting everything. Sometimes it proves maturity by knowing what not to touch. Greenland's fisheries are not isolated from global change. Warming waters can shift species northward, alter spawning patterns, change ice conditions, and affect the predictability of the marine economy. This could create opportunities in some species and losses in others. But change itself is risk. Communities and companies need stability to plan. The North Atlantic food system is also geopolitical. Fish quotas, export markets, processing capacity, trade agreements, and maritime boundaries all shape Greenland's economic future. Control over fisheries was one reason Greenland left the European community. That history remains relevant because food resources are sovereignty resources. As climate change transforms the ocean, Greenland may find itself in a changing fisheries map. New species may appear. Existing species may move. Competition may increase. Scientific monitoring will become essential. So will strong negotiation with markets and partners. This is less dramatic than rare earths, but perhaps more important. Minerals may or may not become the foundation of independence. Fisheries already are the foundation of the economy. The sea has always been Greenland's first strategic resource. Being called strategic can sound flattering. It means a place matters. It means powerful people pay attention. It means investment may come. But being strategic also carries a cultural cost. The outside world begins speaking about the place in terms of function. Greenland becomes important because of where it is, what lies beneath it, what can be built on it, what can be tracked from it, what route passes near it. That kind of attention can make local culture seem secondary. Music, language, family life, humor, religion, food, grief, art, and ordinary politics are pushed aside by maps and minerals. People become symbolic. Indigenous guardians of nature, residents near a base, stakeholders in a mine, voters in an autonomy debate. Their full humanity is flattened into relevance. Greenland's artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, and cultural workers resist that flattening. They show Greenland as lived experience, not only strategic object. They complicate the outside gaze. They remind the world that a place can be globally important and personally intimate at the same time. A people survives not only by controlling land, but by controlling representation. Greenland's future will depend partly on who tells its story. The missionary period in Greenland reshaped spiritual life, education, and cultural memory. Christianity became deeply rooted in Greenlandic society, but it arrived through a colonial encounter that also pressured older beliefs and practices. Like many colonized peoples, Greenlanders absorbed, adapted, resisted, and transformed what came from outside. This history is not simple. Missionaries brought literacy and religious institutions, but also participated in a broader system of cultural control. Some Greenlanders embraced Christianity sincerely. Others experienced the loss of older cosmologies and social practices. The result was not a clean replacement, but a layered spiritual world. The missionary legacy matters because it shows how power enters through meaning, not only through force. To govern a people, empires often try to reshape what counts as truth, morality, education, and civilization. Greenland's colonial history was partly a battle over these categories. Modern sovereignty, therefore, includes cultural recovery, not necessarily a rejection of everything inherited, but the right to decide what those inheritances mean. Greenland's identity today is not pre-colonial purity. It is a living mixture shaped by history, injury, faith, adaptation, and choice. If Greenland eventually becomes independent, defense will become one of the hardest questions. A fully sovereign Greenland would still sit in a strategically vital location. It would not be able to defend its territory alone in a conventional military sense. It would need agreements, partnerships, and probably continued cooperation with the United States, Denmark, and NATO structures in some form. This is not unusual for small states. Many small countries rely on defense arrangements. But Greenland's case is especially sensitive because defense has been one of the main areas where Greenlandic authority has been limited. Independence would not automatically remove foreign military presence. It might instead require renegotiating that presence under new terms. The key question would be consent and benefit. Could Greenland host necessary defense infrastructure while gaining more authority, transparency, environmental protection, and economic return? Could it remain aligned with Western security without becoming a military dependency? Could it prevent outside powers from using defense as leverage over domestic policy? These questions are practical, not theoretical. Independence movements sometimes focus on symbols, but security agreements often define the real limits of sovereignty. Greenland's future statecraft will have to be unusually sophisticated from the first day. The relationship between Denmark and Greenland cannot be reduced to the block grant. Money matters, but history matters too. Denmark benefited from authority over Greenland for generations. It shaped institutions, trade, education, and international status. It also made decisions that Greenlanders did not fully control. That creates obligations that are not simply charitable. A mature Danish approach would understand support for Greenland as part of a historical relationship, not as a favor to be used rhetorically. If Greenland seeks greater capacity, Denmark has reason to help build it. If Greenland moves toward independence, Denmark has reason to support a stable transition rather than treat it as abandonment. If Greenland demands more voice in defense and foreign policy, Denmark has reason to listen. This does not mean Denmark must agree with every Greenlandic political demand. Partnerships can involve disagreement, but the tone matters. Paternalism can survive even in polite language. A former colonial power must be careful not to confuse its fear of losing influence with concern for the other's welfare. What Denmark owes, above all, is respect for Greenland's right to become more fully itself. The United States also owes Greenland more than strategic attention. It has used Greenland's location for defense since the Second World War. Its base presence has shaped local history, environment, and politics. American officials often speak of Greenland's importance to U.S. security, but importance should create responsibility, not entitlement. A serious American partnership would invest in Greenlandic capacity, respect local authority, consult openly, support environmental cleanup, avoid acquisition rhetoric, and recognize that Greenland's future cannot be decided through pressure on Denmark alone. It would treat Greenlanders as partners, not obstacles between Washington and territory. America's best argument for influencing Greenland is not that it is powerful. Greenland already knows that. Its best argument would be that it can be trusted. Trust requires restraint. It requires showing that American interest does not mean American possession. It requires understanding that allies are not assets and that small peoples remember disrespect. If Washington wants Greenland close, it must stop speaking as if closeness can be forced. In the Arctic, respect may be the most strategic resource of all. Greenland also faces obligations to itself. Outside pressure is real, but not every difficult choice can be blamed on outsiders. A society moving toward greater sovereignty must build transparency, avoid elite capture, strengthen institutions, invest in education, protect public debate, and resist the temptation of easy money. Self-determination is a right, but it is also a discipline. The danger of being wanted is that different outside actors may try to cultivate different local allies. Mining companies may support one set of voices. Foreign governments may favor another. Development promises can divide communities. Strategic attention can inflate egos and distort politics. Greenland will need strong democratic habits to avoid becoming a marketplace for external influence. This is not a criticism unique to Greenland. Every small society facing large outside pressure must guard against internal fragmentation. The stronger the institutions, the better the bargaining position. The clearer the public rules, the harder it is for outsiders to buy shortcuts. Greenland's future will not be protected by geography alone. It will be protected by political integrity. Some planners imagine future Arctic cities, ports, logistics hubs, research campuses, mining towns, military support centers, tourist gateways. Greenland could see versions of this urban future if investment accelerates. Nuuk may grow. Other towns may change. New settlements or industrial zones may be proposed. The island's urban geography could shift dramatically. This raises a question: what kind of modernity does Greenland want? More buildings and roads do not automatically mean a better society. A new Arctic city could create opportunity, but it could also import inequality, outside labor dependence, high costs, and cultural dislocation. Urban growth must be planned around Greenlandic needs, not only investor timelines. The best Arctic city would not be a foreign enclave dropped into the landscape. It would be connected to local governance, language, education, housing, and environmental limits. It would serve the society around it rather than becoming an island of extraction. Greenland does not need to reject modernity. It needs to choose its form. That choice may become one of the most important debates of the next generation. A common outside fantasy imagines a melting Arctic as an easy new world. Open water, shipping lanes, ports, minerals, tourism, and military mobility. But an ice-free fantasy oversimplifies reality. Less ice does not mean no danger. Arctic waters remain harsh. Weather can be violent. Darkness, remoteness, limited infrastructure, and environmental fragility continue to shape everything. The fantasy is dangerous because it encourages premature ambition. Companies may underestimate cost. Governments may overstate access. Strategists may assume mobility before support systems exist. Tourists may treat a fragile environment as an adventure playground. The Arctic may be opening, but it is not becoming ordinary. Greenland knows this better than outsiders. The island's environment has always demanded respect. Climate change is not removing that demand. It is changing its form. New dangers replace old ones. Unstable ice, unpredictable weather, coastal erosion, ecological shifts, and emergency response gaps all complicate the future. The Arctic is not a new Mediterranean. It is a changing Arctic. That distinction matters. Greenland often enters global media through spectacle, purchase proposals, ice melt, rare earths, polar bears, military bases, or dramatic photographs of icebergs. These stories attract attention, but they can also distort. They turn Greenland into a headline rather than a society. The media loves simple frames. America wants Greenland. China wants minerals. Denmark is nervous. NATO watches Russia. Ice is melting. All of those are parts of the story. But if repeated without depth, they become a new kind of erasure. Greenlanders appear as background voices in a drama starring everyone else. Better storytelling would begin in Greenlandic politics, history, and daily life. It would ask what people in Nuuk, Ilulissat, Sisimiut, Qaqortoq, Tasiilaq, and smaller communities want. It would show disagreement inside Greenland rather than pretending there is one simple national view. It would treat the island as modern and complex, not merely remote and symbolic. Who tells Greenland's story matters because stories shape policy. If the world thinks Greenland is empty, it will behave accordingly. If it understands Greenland as a political society, it may be forced to behave differently. The world is full of places that were promised prosperity through extraction and left with pollution, inequality, corruption, or dependency. Oil states, mining towns, tropical forests, mountain regions, and indigenous lands have all heard the language of development before. Sometimes development delivered real benefits. Often it delivered wealth to outsiders and problems to locals. Greenland has the advantage of arriving at its resource moment with many warnings available. It can study what happened elsewhere. It can design stronger rules before the boom. It can demand local ownership, environmental bonds, transparent contracts, community consent, and long-term planning. It can avoid building a national budget too heavily around volatile commodity prices. But warnings only help if they are heeded. The pressure will be intense. Companies will promise urgency. Governments will frame projects as strategic. Supporters will argue that independence requires revenue. Opponents may be accused of blocking the future. In that environment, slow democratic scrutiny becomes essential. A resource boom can build sovereignty or destroy it. Greenland's challenge is to make sure that if the minerals come out, power does not leave with them. The future of Greenland may come down to a bargain between three forces: the desire for sovereignty, the need for economic resilience, and the pressure of strategic geography. If any one of these dominates completely, the outcome becomes dangerous. Sovereignty without money becomes fragile. Money without sovereignty becomes dependency. Strategy without consent becomes domination. Greenland must balance all three. It must build an economy strong enough to support choice. It must manage defense relationships without surrendering political authority. It must pursue independence or deeper autonomy in a way that improves everyday life, not only national symbolism. The outside world will try to simplify this. America will speak of security. Europe will speak of partnership. Companies will speak of development. Denmark will speak of responsibility. China may speak of investment. Russia will shape the threat environment. But Greenland has to speak in a more complete language because it is the place where all these forces land. The final Arctic bargain must begin with a principle that should not be radical but still needs repeating. Greenland is not valuable because others want it. It is valuable because it is itself. Greenland's story is not a sudden story. It only feels sudden to those who are not paying attention. The island has always been there, inhabited, governed, studied, used, loved, misunderstood, and contested. What changed is the outside world's appetite. Climate changed. Power shifted. Supply chains tightened. The Arctic warmed. Rivalries returned. And then the world looked north and acted surprised to find a future waiting there. But Greenland is not waiting passively. It is debating, deciding, resisting, negotiating, and imagining. Its people are not symbols of ice. They are citizens of a society moving through one of the most consequential transitions on Earth. Their choices will matter not only to themselves, but to the Arctic, the North Atlantic, and the wider politics of sovereignty in a warming world. The island everyone suddenly wants may become a base, a partner, a mineral supplier, an independent state, a climate warning, a tourism destination, a diplomatic center, or some combination of all of these. But the most important question remains unchanged. Will Greenland be allowed to define itself? If the answer is yes, then the Arctic future may yet be different from the imperial past. If the answer is no, then the scramble for Greenland will become another chapter in the old story of powerful outsiders discovering a place only when they decide they need it. The ice is melting. The world is arriving. Greenland is speaking. This time, the world should listen.